So we structured today's presentation around the question, why does NATO cover the topic of societal resilience? How do we go about and where are we headed? And I will give you a brief overview over the developments within NATO in the last decade, and then try to look ahead with the next decade, this decade of the 2020s is bringing us. So within NATO, there's this big realm of civil planning groups. It has existed since the foundation of NATO. There are a couple of them. One of them is called the Civil Protection Group, another one, for example, the Transport Group. Why do we have these civil groups? It's founded in the North Atlantic Treaty in Article 3 that in order to really implement the objectives of the NATO treaty, all the parties, both separately and jointly, must maintain effective self-help and mutual aid. So in a nutshell, this is really the task for any member of the alliance to have a very, very strong setup, both in the military and in the civil field, to have what the Norwegians would call a total defense concept. So a whole of security approach for each member state, having the idea that if each member of the alliance is very, very strong, both civil and military, they can project this aspect of stability and security to the whole of the alliance, to the benefit of the alliance. So already our founding fathers in 1949 covered this mainly in their treaty. And in 2014, when the Crimea was invaded by Russia and the hostile activities then started in the Donbas in eastern Ukraine later, NATO decided to really give a very, very strong response to this aggression inside of Europe. And we saw, and that will be the next slide, at the Warsaw Summit in 2016, how building resilience into the alliance along all levels was really put together in a commitment that all heads of governments and states signed up to. And this is the Enhanced Resilience Committee from 2016. And working up to this commitment in 2016, my group, the Civil Protection Group, had been working on resilience for many, many years. We started out with the topic in 2012. We looked at how to project stability and security on community level with being resilient. We tried to give an explanation to the term of resilience. We said it's the response to an exogenous shock and the capacity and ability to build back better, so to be to get back on track with a stronger feature than before the crisis. And we looked at all kinds of man-made and technological disasters and natural disasters around the globe, and tried to understand why communities perform so differently, even if the challenge might be the same, and what are the core qualifications that a community gets back on track rather quickly, or that it might take a long time, or that a community is devastated forever. And then all this thinking was growing within NATO, and it grew into thinking resilience meaning hardening your structures, making your structures more capable to deal with shocks, to adapt after shock. And the whole concept of how are we strong as an alliance came back to this core idea that we need to strengthen both the civil and the military side. In the Brussels summit this year, it was decided to strengthen again this resilience commitment from 2016 and to put forward a new commitment. And in this commitment, all the work that we have been doing in the last decade is not only being looked upon and judged as absolutely core and elemental to the alliance, but the steps for the next decade are being set out. So that would be my next slide. Based on this very, very long history of thinking in lines of preparedness, what we then today call strong resilience qualities, and having in mind the changed security environment since 2014, all nations were called upon to look inside their nations what they have in their toolbox to be prepared and well equipped to answer to a crisis that might be a traditional conflict. We thought when the wall came down, we had stepped away from this time of traditional conflicts, or other crises that might challenge us. I remind you that there's not only the military conflict in people, but also the conflict when it comes to the cyber vector, and all countries in the last decade had to prepare for that. How did they do this? They all had to adopt more or less a whole-of-government approach, where all the national structures and assets would flow together, and all of them had to consider their resources, bearing in mind that a lot of services had been sourced out in the decades before due to privatizations and cutbacks. So the civil and the military sector had to realize they were no longer in possession sometimes of critical resources, and that they were both competing with the private sector, competing with each other for resources that the private sector is now holding, and that this private sector might be neither a national private sector nor an allied private sector, but a private sector even beyond the alliance's borders, with all the implications this has if you think about security of supply. When we started thinking about this in NATO, we were still a group of nearly 40 people. With the deteriorating security landscape since 2014, the partners have more or less left the table. We are now down to formats where we have a very close cooperation, the alliance plus Sweden and Finland, and sometimes Switzerland at the table. So the group is much smaller. What has increased simultaneously, that is really the very, very strong cooperation with the EU to not produce duplication, but to look for complementarity. And in some subject matters, we're also looking for cooperation with other international organizations who hold capacities and knowledge to not duplicate there either. Next slide, please. You will see the 2016 Warsaw Resilience Commitment spelled out again, where the heads of state and governments said, we are today making a commitment to enhance resilience against the full spectrum of threats, including hybrid threats from any direction. And then national resilience you see in the next quotation, and then the quotation, NATO military forces can at all times be supported. So next slide, please. What do we learn from this commitment in 2016 and these quotes? We learn about, again, the three core functions of NATO, and that is civil support to the military and continuity of government, and if you turn the slide, the continuity of essential services. So these three functions are at the heart of civil preparedness. And what we were doing in the planning groups was we were thinking about how to fill these three core functions that might sound very abstract to a national servant in the government in the alliance, to explain it further. What is really the tasking on the national level for capitals to work through in this whole of government approach? And we split it up in 7 requirements, what we call the 7 baseline requirements. And we agreed, all nations agreed, and international staff developed all the thinking and the philosophy behind this, that if each nation works on these 7 baseline requirements cross-government the whole of the year, then the security of the alliance as a total will have a great boost. And I will read them out because I think they're really worth reading them out. And whatever we do in reform, we always come back to these 7. The first one is the continuity of government and critical government services. So in a pandemic, that means, for example, know your key personnel. Whom do you send home? Who needs to come? Who needs to stay? Who needs to run the offices? Who needs to sit in government? Who can ensure that if a head of state or head of government falls ill, that he is immediately replaced, that there's no shortcoming in the continuity of a government in a crisis and of the services a government supplies. If you only think about, for example, paying out pensions, and you have a cyber attack on your money system, and there's a high hazard that the money will run out and will not be paid out to people, This is something you have to think about under continuity of government and continuity of critical government services. Number two is more or less self-explicatory, resilient energy supplies. There's nearly no service anymore without energy behind it. We are digitalized to a stage that without energy, there are little services and plans still running, and this is true both for the civil and the military side, of course. Then the ability to deal effectively with the uncontrolled movement of people, and this can mean any scenario from people running from a disaster, people running from an attack, people being ambushed, people being cut off from energy resources and leaving parts of the alliance to move to other parts of the alliance, people being maybe under CBRN attack and being infected and running for help. This is a particular challenge to territories within the alliance with a very small population and a small geographical size. The next topic is resilient food and water resources. In a crisis, without food and water, nobody can help anybody anymore because people will run dry, and hungry people are not very good helpers. An ability to deal with mass casualties. We're seeing this, unfortunately, a lot in the pandemic, that mass casualties is a topic, how to organize a health system, how to organize a country if the capacities run dry. Resilient civil communication systems. I think the pandemic and today me being on the phone is an excellent example of the need for redundancies and functioning both sound and imagery, and there's a lot still lagging in communication, but of course in a crisis you need interoperable communication between all forces, both civil and military. And then finally, and really one of the core requirements is the civil transportation systems resiliency. If you cannot transport your energy, if you cannot transport your food and water, if you cannot transport people, it will be very, very hard to keep your country up and running and to have a population that stays behind you. What do we have in NATO's toolbox to advance the topic of resiliency and civil preparedness? Next slide, please. We have developed in our planning groups along a pool of 444 civil experts, that is people working in the field of transport, working for big telecompany corporations, doctors with experiences from actual mass casual scenarios, all kinds of experts that are open, that are accessible for NATO to give information, but also to take part in missions. What missions do we hold? We have offered and built up advisory support teams. We have advisory support teams for resilience. We have rapid reaction teams for hybrid threats. These teams can be requested by nations, and then they travel to your capital, and they will make sure to sit down with both the civil and the military side to understand each other's languages and to see where help and best practice advice is needed. We have, of course, training and exercises, including the traditional crisis management exercise that NATO does herself. We have a center, the EADRCC, that's the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response and Coordination Center, that can coordinate anything from information to sandbags or blood reserves being sent across the alliance, and to enhanced partners in our enhanced cooperation framework. We develop guidelines to help nations streamline their own political and policy changes efforts, and we exchange, of course, best practice, and we try to project whatever we achieve within the alliance in partner countries. What we also try to do, either because we are tasked or out of our free will, and actually on society resilience, it started in our group, it was a self-initiative, we try to pinpoint the gist of what we are thinking in papers, and to distribute these papers across the alliance, and to then discuss with partners, to invite third parties to take part in our discussions and guide us further. So we have a paper on enhancing societal resilience. We wanted to acknowledge the important role civil societies and citizens play in effective preparation for and response to crises and emergencies. we recognized very, very early on that in a crisis, however your military and state capacities may be, in the first moments, it's always the local population who has to respond. It's the local first responders. The strength, the backbone in a longer crisis sits with the citizen, with the civil society. They provide a lot of knowledge. They provide a lot of goodwill. They often provide money. We saw it in the example in Ukraine that they were really the backbone of keeping Ukraine up and running against the attacks in the east, a lot of support to charities, a lot of donations. So we saw that there's a lot of power with the citizen. The citizen is also targeted by hostile information, by hybrid campaigns, by disinformation campaigns. So the better the citizen is equipped, meaning in education, but also in access to all kinds of modern tools of communication, the better the strength of civil society can connect and cooperate in a crisis. Next slide, please. What we did on top of this, of course, we were working with crisis scenarios before, and the pandemic was a possible scenario. And then when the pandemic hit, it also hit the Alliance as an organization. And we asked allies to respond to a first set of questions that we drew together in a report on the first round of lessons learned from COVID-19, because as the pandemic isn't over, there is still not a lot to learn in the future. But some aspects have already been defined, and they will stand in the long run. I think there will be a conclusion even once the pandemic is really, really over. And one of these findings is that we have long-standing vulnerabilities, such as shortages of medical supplies. We have shortages in personal protective equipment in hospitals, for example, in vaccines, vaccine production, in therapeutics, and in testing capabilities. And this is, of course, a weakness that is even more deepened if we think about the diversity of supply chains, in particular for medical countermeasures. What we have sourced out to outside of the alliance, all of this can be cut off for the alliance herself. And this is, of course, a vulnerability one politically should think about if one would not maybe want to change that in the long run. I know this is a very long road to go down to, but to see these interdependencies, and especially to see it in critical sectors, it's very, very worrisome for somebody who works in civil defense, and also worrisome for the military, because this idea of civil-military cooperation is, of course, very difficult to get through when there's a total lack of resources for both sectors, when they're both cut off their supply chains for basically staying alive. So we identified the need for a holistic approach to pandemic response, and we saw that it's necessary to involve key public and private sector stakeholders as well as citizens. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before the founding paper, the treaty from 1949, then the resilience commitment from 2016, and the strengthened resilience commitment from this year, from this summer. And we put down a couple of quotes from the summit, and it says explicitly by the heads of state and government, resilience is a national responsibility and a collective commitment. And this collective commitment is important because it implies we go down the road together. How we go down the road, this is decided on the national level, but the goal we want to reach at the end of the road, this is collectively identified, and we strive for it collectively, and we commit collectively to achieving this goal. And it even said we will adopt a more integrated and a better coordinated approach, because we want to reduce the vulnerabilities, and we want to ensure that our militaries can effectively operate. And also, you see further down, the cooperation with the European Union was mentioned again. So next slide, please. Why this enhanced EU-NATO cooperation on resilience so important? Because the thinking is the same within NATO. We have the work stream within the EU. We have the work stream around the strategic compass for the EU for security and defense. And within NATO, we have this big bulk of resilience work. And we have a shared common nation of nearly 500 million people. So that's 500 million and 500 million outside of the alliance. And it's really worth looking at each other's concept together. There's this huge overlap between both international organizations, and especially the smaller countries, they cannot afford to duplicate what their activities in the EU and at NATO or vice versa. So we have increased dialogue. We have an exchange between both response centers, the EU Response Center, EADICC, the NATO Response Center, EADICC, and the EU Response Center, the former MIC, the now ERCC. We try to discuss the exchange of best practices and how we manage evaluations and assessments. The SecGen of NATO has for the first time been to the College of Commissioners at the EU. They have both been welcomed guests at each other's summits, and on a working level, Kanya here, the staff officer from the IS, has met with the people from the EU working groups, and they have discussed their workloads. And at our last NATO Director General's meeting, we had the EU counterpart at the table giving a briefing about what the EU is doing under its Critical Entities Resilience Directive and how this can be compared to NATO's resilience baseline requirements. Next slide, please. So in my final minutes, I will give you an idea how we try to look ahead. So this is what are we implementing in this decade. You've maybe heard about NATO's Agenda 2030. The idea is for allies to develop national resilience goals and then implementation plans to reach these goals. This is a process, sounds very simple, can be very tricky and complicated because it has to be streamlined and synchronized with NATO's defense planning cycle. All allied nations are in the NATO defense planning cycles where they have targets to reach, and these can be laid out in quantifications. And so far we have a quality that we are striving for, but no quantity in civil preparedness and in civil defense. And with the resilience goals, we will try to pinpoint even further what is collectively identified as necessary and where a commitment exists for allies to work towards this goal, and then how they implement it. This will be their national process, which shall be supported by NATO's planning groups. Also, the alliance has decided to appoint and then gather in Brussels the senior official in each government for the topic of resilience. So each capital is now asked to produce a deputy minister or director, whatever their highest level, their highest senior official level is for resilience, for countering threats to national and alliance resilience. And then they are supposed to meet from next year onward in Brussels on a regular basis. And the Council has decided that they want to reorganize the committee structure at headquarters. So the planning groups so far have reported to a committee that is called the CEPSI, the Civil Emergency Preparedness Committee, and this will be renamed into something like a resilience committee with possibly an enlarged portfolio of competencies. And there's a strong link to the work that is being done in the field of countering hybrid threats. When you think about disinformation, when you think about cyber attacks, when you think about people invading a country without bearing really the national military signs, but of course they belong to a state actor behind. So a lot of this resilience work is also linked to the hybrid work, and we will see what new competences this new committee will get, what final name it will hold, and the planning groups, such as my planning group, will be called upon to report to this then newly established committee, which will start its work in the upcoming year 2022. So this was a very quick run-through in how NATO is building resilience through civil preparedness and how we are trying to leverage all the knowledge and capacity that we have from the field of civil preparedness, civil emergency planning, and civil defense. And you understand that without this very, very close cooperation with the military side, it will be impossible to have a wholesome approach and a strong whole national defense. If you call it total defense or whole of something defense, doesn't really matter, but the idea is to bring all the competences and resources together to really project inside your nation and inside the alliance and with partners of the alliance a much, much stronger security. Thank you very much.